Hello everyone, Joe the CRM chap here with a brand new video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a subject which is really close to my heart, custom pricing engines within Dynamics 365 customer engagement. So first of all we're going to set the scene, give you a bit of an overview in terms of what custom pricing plugins are, why would you consider using them in the first place, what type of business scenarios can they address when using them, and I guess the most important question of all, how do you actually get started with them? From there, we're going to jump into a scenario that has been created for the purpose of this session today, and we're going to talk through the high level, what we're going to try and sort of achieve. The whole aim of this is to basically give us a solution that we can then deploy out into our environment, and we can see as part of deploying it out the exact process of what is involved when building out a custom pricing plugin. And we're going to do some coding as part of that. Don't be too worried if you're a bit unfamiliar with C# or with any of the sort of higher concepts around coding. We're going to try and cover them as part of this video. And then finally, we'll close things off with just a few remarks for myself of things that you need to sort of think about and bear in mind when you're working with custom pricing plugins, because sometimes they can be a little bit of a minefield. So a little bit of info about me on this slide here. So I work for a company based down in Reading in the UK. We do a number of different things. We're a Microsoft partner, but we also do things such as direct mail fulfillment and things like that. I've been working with Dynamics 365 customer engagement for well over 4 years now, back to the sort of the early days of CRM 2015, 2016, etc. Since then, I've also expanded out, doing a lot of work these days with things such as Microsoft Azure, Power BI. DevOps is a huge thing for us at the moment, and I'm also a Prince 2 project manager as well. I'm involved as part of the official user group for Dynamics 365 based in the Northwest. We have meetings fairly regularly up in Manchester in the UK. If you do ever find yourself in Manchester or want to speak at an event, then please do reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to have a chat and try and get involved as part of the user group. So they say always begin with a story. So once upon a time, I was doing some work for a customer of mine, and I think it was fair to say at the time they were having a bit of a nightmare really. They were trying to get Dynamics 365 customer engagement working for them in regards to their sales processes. They had a whole bunch of custom logic and functionality they wanted to apply when they were calculating their various sales documents, and they just weren't able to get a solution that was fit for purpose and sort of working in place. And there was a lot of convoluted, a lot of backwards and forwards, and just not a really nice time being had as a consequence of that. So I was sort of tasked to sort of come in and do a bit of a investigation, evaluation of the environment, flag up a couple of things and see how we could potentially get things working better for them. And there were a couple of things that sort of came out as part of that, as part of the sort of the sort of detailed study of their environment. The first of all was that it was what I would term workflow Armageddon. So you had so many, dozens and hundreds of potential workflows in the system. The screenshot here gives you a bit of an example in terms of what was in there, but really probably you would times that by at least 4 to get the true measure of that. So all sorts of different workflows doing, containerized logic, calculating all the invoice totals, one for calculating opportunity lines, one for factoring in a particular custom field. Really just a whole load of different workflows, which just made it really difficult to sort of understand. And then we started to get a bit more deeper into looking at the solution. Then you started to see the word new crop up quite a lot. Now, for those of you who are not so used to customization when it comes to Dynamics, typically what you would do is you would create components using a solution prefix, a publisher, and you would make sure that all your customizations are prefixed, with a unique value. When it's new underscore prefix, that's generally sort of bad practice and can cause you some issues when you're working with components that are the same sort of name. So I think it's fair to say by the time I've sort of done evaluating the environment, my reaction was probably more akin to this. I was ready to start sort of saying, there's some real issues here that we need to start to address. So what are those in a nutshell? Well, the great thing about a system like Dynamics 365 customer engagement is that it's designed to help you build out these really effective functional solutions, which is great because we don't want to be having to pay for expensive developers or reinventing the wheel constantly each time we need to add business logic on. We want to be able to just get it out there quick. And that's what's so great about Dynamics 365 customer engagement. But really, there comes a point where, okay, if you're trying to then use the same functional solutions you're given to effectively try and reverse engineer a system, that's when you're going to start hitting problems, because you're trying to sort of it's like trying to get a square peg to fit a round hole. You're just going to store up problems. It's going to be more of an uphill battle, and over time, your solution is going to get even more potentially convoluted. And really, that's when you start to see risks in the business. You start having a solution in place which is really difficult for others to understand. It's poorly implemented, as we saw earlier. For example, not using best practice approaches to get things deployed out, and really makes it very hard for senior people in the business, if there is an issue or something happens, for them to go in there and understand the system and get a real handle on it. I guess a good way of thinking about it is, if I sort of borrow in a way a quote from sort of Albert Einstein: if you can't express your business logic in less than 3 workflows, then you don't understand it yourself. What I mean by this is that, the fact that you're having to sort of go off and create, workflow here, workflow there, workflow there, workflow there, it shows in my mind, okay, you've not actually sat down and mapped out what your process needs to be, and you haven't tried to, for example, containerize that into a single workflow stream, that executes, once. You just got, all this stuff that you just try to bolt on, sticky plaster on, and things like that. And as a consequence, you're not really going to be able to have a good handle in terms of what your business logic is doing. And ultimately, what we're seeing as part of the scenario that I just described is that you've got a really poor appreciation of what capabilities you've got within the platform, as in customer engagement. There's not been that sort of detailed scoping. There's not been a sort of recognition of what the platform can do to help you, build a really effective solution. And I guess in my mind that would probably be the sort of the greatest sin of all, really, because you're not having you've not got that appreciation, most crucially, and you're not spending the time to really understand how the sort of platform works. So these are some of the problems, I guess, when we start to look into the scenario I mentioned a few minutes ago. So this is where potentially a good potential scenario where custom pricing could come in and start to help to deliver a better solution. But what is custom pricing, most importantly? It's effectively a means of replacing the various out-of-the-box calculations that customer engagement performs when you're creating a quote, adding products onto that quote, etc. You can effectively just disable all of that functionality, and then if you then have got the appropriate access from a development point of view, you can then go in and start to inject custom logic into there, and you hook into a specific message that the application provides, sort of a catch-all for. So whenever a particular record type is being calculated, the calculate price message is basically run to do the various calculations. And as a developer, I can basically just go into there, I can attach my custom logic on top of this message, and this will then make sure that my custom pricing logic will trigger whenever the following records here are interacted with, whether that's sort of retrieved, whether they're created or updated. Anytime these particular events occur in the application, your custom logic is going to be executed. And as a developer, I would typically use C# to build out that custom logic. You do have the ability to use Visual Basic.net or VB.net if you so choose. Generally these days what I would recommend is that C# is the way to go. If you're just starting out and trying to figure out, okay, how can I actually start to do custom development with Dynamics 365 customer engagement, then look at C# as your first preference. Visual Basic.net is quite nice. You can do some fun things with it when it comes to working with Office applications, so creating macros or bolt-ons for Microsoft Access, but really it's not something that's going to hold you in good stead from a career point of view, in my view. I quite like Visual Basic.net, but there's not the demand there. It's not really something which, it's more something there's a little bit of fun maybe to play around with more than anything. So what are the sort of benefits a custom pricing solution can deliver then? Really, the key thing that you've got with it is that when you're using it, you've got the full capabilities within the platform's underlying SDK at your disposal. And as part of that, that means that you can apply practically any different type of business logic that you so need to, whether it's both within the SDK in terms of maybe retrieving records, doing complex transformations, maybe going off and creating additional records. All of that is within your sort of remit when you're developing a custom pricing solution, which is really great. And an additional benefit is that, okay, well, let's say you want to have differing business logic depending on the particular entity that you're working with based on the list that we saw earlier. The great thing about this solution is that you can tailor your business logic to apply to just one of those entities, maybe to 2, or just a whole lot of them. And you can have the various, you have the capability to go off and trigger any custom logic you want to wherever you want to, which is really great. And really, the way I would see a custom pricing solution having the most benefit is that if you go back to the earlier scenario and you've got a really complex implementation involving multiple workflows and quite complex logic, really a custom pricing solution gives you a means of isolating that and putting it into a nice sort of box. And then the benefits of that is that can then be included as part of your solutions more easily. You can deploy that out into multiple environments. You've got a really nice solution sort of wrapped in a box, in a bow, that can go off and do whatever you need to. And then finally, because you're using a custom plugin, any logic that's being applied will always apply regardless of how the records are sort of trickling in to the system. So if you've got a custom solution, so maybe you've got a Canvas Power Apps, maybe you've got a Power Apps portal, etc., you want to make sure that custom pricing logic is being enforced. The good thing is you don't have to do any additional work on top of that to get that logic to be obeyed. It will just work, and that can really help when it's in terms of speeding up development cycles and not having to go off and think, okay, well, what about this? Have we thought about this, etc. No, it's just going to work, and that for me is a really great benefit of this. So what are some potential use cases for it then? The major one, I guess, for me would be, because you're using the SDK and because you're using custom code, you've got the ability as part of that to do external integrations. So if you've got a separate system, maybe an API that you need to be able to query to get to get additional pricing information related to products, then this can be achieved, and you can then factor that in as part of your calculations. A major benefit is that out of the box, you've got no way of bringing in custom fields easily enough as part of your sales calculations. This solution lets you do that with ease. You've got capability to be able to do bespoke and custom error messages. So if there's particular business conditions that are violated as part of any logic that is performed when you're calculating your prices, error messages can be then fed through to the user so they can then take meaningful action off the back of that. And when you start looking at some of the wider features that you've got as part of plugins, so for example in this case working with pre and post images, so snapshots of records, you've got capability here to be able to compare before and after values of a record and then trigger any appropriate logic from that. So maybe you just want to make sure that when a price is updated, there's not too much of a deviation from that. So maybe if you're doing a discounting type scenario, you want to make sure that salespeople are not discounting a particular product by more than 20%, let's say. This lets you do this through having a plugin in place in the first place. So ultimately, the world is your oyster. There's a lot you can start to do, and custom code facilitates that as part of that, which is really great. So how do you get started then with them? You're going to need a few things. First of all, most obviously, the first of those being a custom engagement, an online Dynamics 365 custom engagement tenant. Custom pricing solutions can also work for on-premise versions of Dynamics CRM. I believe pretty much every version from 2013 upwards supports it, so potentially something you can look out for your on-premise deployments if you're still supporting those. You're going to need Visual Studio to develop the code and write the code, and then finally the plugin registration tool is your mechanism of getting your code deployed out, and that's something that again you would access through Visual Studio, and something which we'll show you as part of the demonstration. What I would say, we're going to show you as part of the demo, steps from start to finish. What I would say is that having a bit of an awareness of the following is going to be potentially quite useful. So as I mentioned earlier, C# or VB.NET is potentially very useful. A familiarity of how NuGet packages work, how to basically install those and bring those into your project, again, that will be very useful. And then really just a high level awareness of either the SDK or how the plugin registration tool works will be very useful to you. And as I said earlier, we're going to cover this in today's session, so don't worry too much at this stage if you are a little bit, you're not too sure about how any of these work in particular. So as part of the demo we're going to be doing today, we've got a fictional scenario here. So we've got our organisation. Naming is not particularly important. Contoso, AdventureWorks, Wingtip Toys, choose your name of your organisation. But basically we've been tasked within that organisation with implementing a custom pricing solution. Surprise, surprise. And as part of that, we need to achieve the following requirements. We need to be able to apply discounts at a product line item level. We need to make sure this is done before any tax calculations are applied. And we want to ease this process by giving agents the ability to, or users of the application to, specify a percentage at either the sales document level or the product level, and then for the necessary calculations to take place behind the scenes. So people are not having to get the calculator out and do any manual calculations. The second requirement is that we want to be able to automate the process of calculating freight amount information. In our particular system, we store the information about what it's going to cost to ship a product in a separate entity. So what we need to do as part of this is reference that entity and return what the shipping amount is on a per product basis for every product that we work with as part of our sales documents. And then finally, we want to display an error message to users if they attempt to try and sell a product that's below a particular cost value that we specified on our price list. So we're quite fortunate in that all of the functional components of the solution is ready to go, all the forms, the fields, custom entities, etc. So all we need to do is basically just start coding. And the broad outline process for that will look a little bit something like this. So and this is what we're going to cover as part of the demo. We're going to take a quick look at the environment, see what we've got in there from a setup point of view. We're going to jump into Visual Studio, do the necessary steps to get our project set up and ready. We'll jump in, start to code out the solution, deploy it out using the plugin registration tool, and then we'll just do a quick test in there to make sure that it's all working. And when I say code, it's sort of in inverted commas code. We're going to be doing some cheating here. There's going to be a little bit of copy and paste. Sitting here coding out the whole solution would take potentially many hours to do, and I think you'd probably be quite bored at the end of it. So we're going to sort of try and cheat a little bit so we can get the solution out as quickly as possible. And the focus is more on showing the overall process as part of this. And the good thing is, because you can actually follow along with this yourself if you so choose. So if you are interested in examining the code in detail, then all of the samples that we work with, the managed solutions, the data that we work with, etc. This is all currently on my GitHub page. So all you need to do is basically just navigate to the link on here that's provided by the QR code, or underneath here. I'll put it into the comments below on the video. And what we've got on here, we've got the two Visual Studio solution files, a before and after example. And then I've also within there included more specific instructions as well. So you can obviously refer back to that if you need to, without having to have this video on play all the time. So hopefully that will help you if you are interested in getting familiar with this yourself. Okay, so I think we've covered everything that we need to, so now let's jump in. Let's start coding. Okay, so we've jumped into Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement Online, and as we can see, we've got the very nice and snazzy looking October release deployed to our environment, which is looking really great. We can see we've got a custom model-driven app that we've deployed out. So this is basically the custom pricing solution that you'll find on the GitHub repository. So this app just basically exposes out most of the core entities that we're going to be working with as part of the sample. Also exposes out the freight amount custom entity. So this is what we're going to be using to store a sort of pound in the pence value for shipping for each of the cities that we're going to be working with as part of the sample. Now all of these mirror the sample data, which is also on GitHub. Is linked to the test example account records that are created in the system on there. You can of course obviously modify those to suit your heart's content, but it's very much designed just to work with the test data that comes out of the system. So the first things first is that we need to actually first of all disable the out-of-the-box system calculations within the application. We do this by going to our advanced settings area up here. This will redirect us out into the good old classic interface. We then go into administration and then system settings. Then on the sales tab over here, we can see we've got this setting down here called set pricing calculation preference. So by default in everyone's tenant, this will always be set to yes. So with this enabled, it does what it says on the tin. System pricing calculation will be applied. Any custom pricing logic that has been deployed out will be ignored. So first things first, to make sure that things work as expected, we just change that to no, press OK on there, and then that's done. That's been applied. So now any custom logic that we deploy out and develop will basically be enforced, and we're not going to see any potentially unintended consequences through system calculations being applied. So next step then is to basically jump into Visual Studio. We're going to do continue without code. So for this particular example, we're just going to create a brand new project from scratch. We're going to go up to new project, new project up here.
It's going to want to be a class library.NET framework. We can see it's basically been pinned up here because I've used it before. So I'll just go select it on there. Alternatively, you can just do a quick search on here for class library, and then you just make sure it's a .NET framework, not .NET standard or anything else. And of course, if you so choose, you can of course also do VB.NET, but I would not advise doing that. So select that, press next. You give it a name. We'll just call this D365CE custom pricing sample. It's going to want to store it into I'll just pop it onto my desktop for now. We're going to want to create a folder and a project for it at the same point. Key thing you need to make sure is that it's using if you're on the latest version of .NET Framework, just make sure it's 4.7.1 that you're using, not .2. At the moment, you can't develop plugins using .NET Framework versions that are greater than 4.7.1. That's quite a mouthful. So yeah, just make sure you've got that enabled on there, and then you should be good to go. So we're going to create that. So I'm going to go through and create all the various gubbins and things that it does when it first does it. And the first things first that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to get in our SDK references, the things, our references to the assemblies, but also more crucially, a NuGet package for the latest version of the plugin registration tool, which we have to get now through NuGet instead. So we're going to go to references up here. We're going to right click, go to manage NuGet packages. We're going to go to browse up here. And then we're going to want to type in Microsoft.crm SDK, and then it'll be, we can do XRM tooling first of all to get the plugin registration. Let's give that a minute. There it is. So we're going to want to install that. I don't want to show that again. Just click, yep, I accept, okay. That's been installed in now, and then the next one we're going to need is our core assemblies. So it does take a little bit of your head getting around initially just to work with NuGet, but I think once you're familiar with it, it's a pretty nice experience. Always make sure that you've got you're getting the latest versions of all your various assemblies. If you're working with source control and things like that, you don't have to worry about including assemblies in your project and things like that. And you also can go back and view previous versions if you so need to. So if you work with older versions of the application, things like that, then you can potentially accommodate those scenarios. So yeah, NuGet is good. Okay, so we've got our NuGet packages. The next thing which you always need to make sure you do is when you're deploying out any assemblies into customer engagement, you need to make sure that they've been assigned. This is done via a strong name key file which you create, or you can use an existing one if you so choose. So in this particular example, we're just going to create one from scratch. We're going to go to our solution properties at the top. We're going to go to the sign in tab down here. We're going to click on sign the assembly. I'm going to click new. We'll call this D365CE custom pricing sample. I'll just call it strong name key. Now you can protect it with a password if you so choose. It's entirely optional really. I'm just going to leave it unchecked for this one. Again, signature algorithm, again you can just leave it as default if you want. Press OK. Save that, and then you'll notice that we've actually got an SNK file that has been added to our project as well. So this is a mandatory requirement if you're deploying anything out into the plugin registration. Using the plugin registration tool, then you're going to have to use that to basically get your plugin deployed out. So next step then, we need to rename our default class. So at the moment it's just called class 1, which is a little bit rubbish. So we'll just rename this into post-op calculate price custom pricing sample. We're going to want to hit a space at the end of that, put in a colon, and then we're going to want to add on we'll rename that first of all, and then we also need to rename the class as well. So let's just copy and paste it from here, like so. And then next thing we need to do is remove redundant using statements at the top, so we get rid of everything apart from using system. And there's a couple that we need to add on. So these are going to be needed for the sample. This is just basically importing various different things that are needed to do the things that we want to do as part of the sample. So using Microsoft XIM.SDK, system.service model, using Microsoft.xim.sdk.query. So that's all of that in there, and then now we can implement our iPlugin interface. We do that by adding the colon and iPlugin at the end of that. At this point we can do control and control full stop, and then we get this option on here, implement interface, which we're going to want to select. And then we just get rid of the throw new not implemented exception down there. Okay, so we've done everything now, and in terms of setting up the plugin class and things like that. Now, just to basically act like probably the best coding sample video in the world ever, we're going to start basically being a bit lazy, and we're going to start copying and pasting stuff in, which is going to be particularly useful. So I'm just going to open up this particular file on here. So this is on the GitHub repository. It's the example code file. This includes basically everything that's needed to build out the solution from start to finish. So we're going to add this in sort of piecemeal, bit by bit. As we go along though, we're going to explain, okay, what is each bit doing. So again, the core aim of this session is not to show you the inner mechanics of C# and how it's all done. It's basically just to explain, okay, what is this code actually doing and why is it needed? And then hopefully then you get a feeling in terms of what you can then go away and maybe start to do on top of it. So first of all, we need our good old boilerplate code. This is what we always need whenever we're doing a plugin of any kind. So the first bit here is we basically just want to get details regarding, okay, what basically the transaction has triggered the plugin. So that's all got into the context in there. And then at this particular point as well, we also want to make sure that we are writing out to the tracing log as well. So we have to basically get a reference to that, and then we just write out to the trace log to confirm that that it's working successfully. So tracing is really important, particularly for online instances, because the debugging experience can be a little bit convoluted sometimes. You typically would have to, play back transactions through Visual Studio for more troublesome errors. What the trace log lets you do is, output basically messages to the logs when certain conditions, happen or occur. So therefore, when you're just diagnosing issues, initially, tracing can be a really great way of being able to do that. Okay, so we've added on our boilerplate. Now we've got a couple of helper methods that are going to be needed to help build out the full sample. So we're just going to add those in one by one now. So I'm just going to hit return twice down here. The first of these is one which is actually provided within the Microsoft sample. It's basically just a little method just to basically confirm that okay, the entities that are being evaluated as part of the plugin are basically ones that are allowed for custom pricing. So all of the entity names that we saw earlier, opportunity, quote, etc., these are all on here. It just returns a true or false. A false if, yep, okay, it is valid, or true, okay, no, it's invalid. It just, so this is what this method is doing on here. It's just a little helper method, so that we're not having to put that into the main bit of code itself. Next helper method, this is one which is used quite a few times in some of the examples that follow. Just going to paste it in here. So this basically just, one of the things that we need to do quite often is that we need to be able to get, so if we're evaluating the opportunity entity, we need to be able to get the name of the related entity, line item entity, so opportunity product in which case, and then likewise if we're working with the opportunity product entity, sometimes we need to get the name of the parent sales entity record. So all this does is basically you feed it a string value of the entity name, and it basically returns the obverse entity or the other related entity as part of that. So it's just to make things a little bit easier when we're having to do that quite regularly, just to have that in a separate method that we can use. The other helper method, as we scroll onto here, works in a sort of similar way, really. So instead of returning the name of the entity, it instead returns the parent ID name field for each of these entities that are listed on here. So again, this is used quite a few times, particularly as part of retrieval operations in the sample. It just gives us a nice, easy way of being able to call this again multiple times without having to do copy and paste and duplicating code and things like that. So that's that method on there. The other helper method is one that does quite a bit of work actually, so we'll actually probably talk through this one in a bit more detail, because this is one of the first methods that does quite a bit of the legwork for the sample. So one of the requirements of the solution is that we want to be able to confirm that we're not selling products below cost price. So in order to do this, we have a method on here that does the evaluation for us and then returns as a true or false to basically say, yep, okay, is this being sold under cost price or not? There's a few different steps it has to do as part of this. So first of all, we need to actually retrieve details about the corresponding price level, the price list on the parent entity record. So because we're evaluating this at line item level, the only way in which we can get information about the price list is by going up a step to the opportunity quote etc record. So what this does here is it just retrieves the ID of that record for us from the parent sales entity record. Then from there we can then, so long as we've actually got a value in that field. If we haven't, then we throw an error because we generally would anticipate that we've got a price list value on there. So what we then do is if we've got a value, we confirm that's all okay. We then build out a query expression to then go off and query that price list, get the various information that we care about from there. So in this case, we want to be able to get the product ID that this relates to, the existing product ID that this relates to. And because we're only wanting to get one of these potentially, but we have to do this as a retrieve multiple operation because there's no way for us to get just one specific record because we don't actually know the ID of the price list product that we want to achieve. But ultimately, all we care about is just getting just the one record back. So that's why we do a specific check on there. Okay, if it's one record in there, we then check to make sure, get the values from that price list item to make sure that it basically tallies up okay, and then we do a comparison on there to make sure that it's all okay. If it's being sold under cost, then all we do is then just set that to true. That'll then throw it back onto there. And then that's basically it. It's just a method just to basically do all of the legwork for us and just return as a very simple, okay, yeah, is this being sold under cost or is this not being sold under cost? And we have some additional sort of logic on here. Okay, we throw a couple of errors if there's problems. So if we can't actually get a line item record, if we can't actually get a price list, then we throw a couple of errors as well on there. So hopefully that's all making sense. There's some comments on there if you want to go back through and just understand what that's doing in a bit more detail. But yeah, that's doing quite a little bit of work there for us, which is why we abstracted it out into a separate method. And then finally, our last sort of semi-complex method is this little one here. So check if pricing is locked. So we're going to want to add it in just below here. So one of the things to be aware of when you're working with order and invoice product records is that generally at that stage in the process there will be the pricing information on those records will be locked. The records will be set to read only, so you won't actually be able to go in and do any calculations against them. If you do, then potentially you're going to start getting errors because you're doing something that's not allowed by the system. You're trying to do an update operation against a read-only record. So what we have to do as part of this particular method is that we have to make sure that we do a check, so that okay, if this record is locked, then we just cancel our execution straight away. We don't do any calculations under any circumstances because yeah, we're going to get errors otherwise. So this basically just does a check on both the order product, which is sales order detail, and then also the invoice detail, which is invoice product, and just does that check for us and then returns an appropriate value as part of pricing locked. So again, that's just a true and false Boolean value that returns as part of that. Okay, so we've got our various helper methods in there, so we're just going to minimize those for now. We'll just get rid of that, that's a little bit too wide, that. Minimize that as well. Minimize that. Let's have a return on there. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is get in our first actual core method, the one that's actually going to be doing a bit of heavy lifting for us. So this will be our calculate line item discount. So if we scroll down a little bit more, just copy and paste that into there. So what is this doing? So similar to what we saw with the line item cost price method, so this is actually going to be doing the heavy lifting in terms of calculating what our discount is. So similar to what we saw with that method up there, we need to basically do some checking as part of the parent sales record to make sure that we've actually got a discount percent value that's present. So in the first case, we generally would check to make sure that because of how the solution's been built out, the custom price solution's been built out, those fields should map across automatically. So if you've specified a discount percentage at the opportunity level, that will feed through automatically to any line products. So we first of all just do a check to make sure that we can actually get those values, and if we do, then we can then just do the discount calculation straight away. Otherwise, if it's not been specified, then instead, okay, well maybe there's been a bit of a mistake there. Maybe instead we need to then go up a level to the parent sales entity to get that value instead. So what the rest of this code here does is that it goes up a level, checks to see that we can get a discount percentage from there, and then once again does the same calculation there to basically do the discount amount on there. If it is the case that we haven't got a discount percentage value specified at all, then all we do in this case is we just return it as a zero amount, and then we just write a warning out to the trace, or sort of say, okay, well, yeah, this might need checking. Maybe maybe there's some business logic that's being violated there potentially. And because generally you wouldn't want to be creating any line item records in isolation anyway, so if it does get to the point where it can't actually find a parent sales entity record, then we just throw an error, an error in this occasion because something has clearly gone wrong. We should have a related opportunity quote, etc. record to this line item record. So let's throw an error just to make sure that that record is ultimately saved. So that's that method on there. And then so if we go to the next one then, so again we've got a similar method that's basically doing the heavy lifting around our freight amounts instead. So again we hive off all of this complex functionality to a separate method, so it can be called from multiple places with relative ease. So as part of this, what we assume is that, okay, well, if we can't actually calculate a freight amount at all, then we just default it to £25. We just assume, okay, well, 25 is, let's say, our default amount regardless of where we want to send it to. So to always make sure that we've got a freight amount of some kind, we just default to 25. So similar to what we saw previously, we build out a query on here to basically go off and get the ship to city value from our parent sales entity record, so opportunity quote, etc. As long as that value isn't null, we then do another query again to then go out and check the freight amount entity that we saw earlier. We basically do a query to get the freight amount value based on the city value, and then if we manage to get that back, all okay, then great, we set that to our freight amount on there. Otherwise, ultimately, we default back to £25 regardless. And because that's set at the top level there, so long as we don't change it further down, which we don't do, then we're always going to get £25 return on here. So again, we're just moving that out into a separate method, all that code, just to make it a little bit easier to reuse it and to manage it as well. So now that we've got all the methods, all the various helper methods that are used as part of this, we can actually start to add in the core methods that we're going to use to do our line item calculations. So I'm just going to grab the next bit of code from down here. Copy that. Okay, so some of the more eagle-eyed ones of you may have already spotted that this seems to be exactly the same code, and you would be right. So we've essentially got the same code for the same method twice, and this is because there's two scenarios where we need to call it. We need to call it when an entity reference is passed as part of the plugin execution, so i.e. whenever the calculate price message is triggered, or alternatively, because of an issue that there appears to be at the moment, I don't know if it's a bug or something like that, we need to also trigger the plugin when a quote line product or quote product record is created. And because that is, from a plugin execution standpoint, because that is exposed as an entity as opposed to an entity reference value, we need to basically reuse this method twice and give the option either way of being able to pass out an entity reference or an entity value. But essentially the core code is the same for both. So all it does is that we basically get all of our, because we've returned an entity reference value, we're not necessarily going to have all the fields that we need to be able to work with, as you know, to do our calculations. So we first of all do a retrieve operation to get all of those and store it together. We get all of the fields in this case. This is something that I would not recommend that you do for production deployments. You would typically list out the fields that you need to be able to return. And this is something that the solution checker with the new Power App Center would actually flag up as being an issue. So this is just for sample purposes, but yeah, don't use this for production deployments because it will slow you down considerably. So once we've got all the details for our line item records, we first of all make sure it's not been locked first of all, using the helper method that we wrote out earlier. We then do our check to make sure, okay, if it's an existing product, we need to make sure that we're not selling it at below cost price value. If it is being sold below cost price value, then we throw an error at that particular point, and the user will receive that. Assuming that's all good and we're all okay, we then go out to start calculating our item discounts. We also do our line item freight calculations as well. We have to handle a specific scenario in here because our opportunity entity does not have a ship to address value. What we do is in this example is we just default that to £25 instead, as we can see up here. And then from there, once we've done the various core calculations that we need in terms of discount and freight, we can then go off and start actually calculating our everything else, every other field, so price per unit, quantity, tax, etc. So we do the calculations up here, so these are written out in the comments as well so you can see them, and then for each one we just output it to the tracing log as well so we can actually see what is going on. And then once it's all done, all the calculations, we then update the record and then we just write out to the trace log to confirm that's all done. So that's all the logic for the line item records, and again this logic is basically repeated line by line exact for this down here, so I'm not going to propose going through that in any great detail, but yeah, this is what it does to calculate your line item records. So with line items calculated, then we can then look at doing the calculations for our sales documents, our opportunities, quotes, etc. So for this then, there's another additional method that we need, which I believe is the final one. So again, similar to what we've done with the line items, we need to actually make sure, okay, we've not got a read-only record, so a one opportunity or something like that. So provided that our record is in an active state, we'll obviously do pricing calculations against it. In this case, we build a query to return all of the related line item documents. We use some of the helper methods from earlier to be able to, for us to figure out, okay, what are the field names that we need to return as part of this. We do a retrieve multiple to get them all, and then we just do sort of a conditional iteration here on just to basically just total up all of those one by one for each record that's returned. We do some additional logic down here to figure out, okay, we want to be able to record, okay, what is the average discount percentage that we've got across all of our different records. So this basically bit of code here just does that calculation on here using just a bit of using an average, using arithmetic mean, average in to be able to get that amount. Then finally, with all that done, same as before, we just basically just go through, update each of the fields individually, and then apply that to the record in question, and then boom, we're done. That record's all up to date. So all of our methods built out and ready to go. We can now actually, so at the moment these are not doing anything, so these are not being called by anything else. Well, when I mean called, these three here are not being called at all. So despite the fact they are actually in code, at the moment the plugin execution would just end at that particular line on there, nothing else would happen. So what we need to look at doing is adding on the remaining logic to ensure that everything else triggers correctly and that the plugin does what it needs to do. So to do that, we finally just need to go in and just add in the remaining code for our execute method. So we'll just grab all that down there. So as we can see, so first of all, we make sure that we've got an expected entity reference object. So this is for our calculate price message. We make sure that that's valid first of all. We do a check to make sure that the name of the entity is correct. Then assuming that is all okay, we then go in and actually then figure out, okay, well, which entity specifically do we need to calculate as part of this operation. We do the thing that I mentioned earlier around making sure we've got a shared variable in there. So it does the checks for infinite loops, and so that nothing naughty occurs. So I'm just going to pause it for 2 seconds. Okay, apologies for that, but I just had that feeling as I was talking about it. Yeah, I've missed out something really important here, and I figured out what it was. So I mentioned earlier around. Well, I don't actually mention this yet. So in terms of when it comes to whenever the custom pricing plugin runs, there's the potential for it to potentially run multiple times, and for potentially it to run child versions of that as part of that. Now that's all expected and well and good, but potentially, and particularly with version 9 of customer engagement, then this could start to cause you some problems with infinite loop errors, where basically the plugin just runs endlessly behind the scenes and it doesn't stop. So what we have to do as part of that is we have to add in some specific logic on here to basically check the parent context and to make sure that the plugin is not already running and therefore causing an infinite loop. So there's two aspects of this. We first of all do a check here at this level here to make sure that we're not in a situation where an infinite loop can occur. And then down here, when we get into the core aspect, when it's doing the core calculation itself, after doing all the pre-checks and things like that, we add a shared variable in there, which is then checked up here to basically ensure that we've not got infinite loops as part of this transaction. So this is a really important bit of code. This should have been included earlier, so just make sure that it's always in there when you're doing a custom pricing solution, because otherwise you are going to have potential problems or errors. But it's all good now. I've added it into there. We've also got our remaining code down here, so let's just go through the rest of this down here. So I mentioned about the shared variables already. Because we're doing things with the service, retrieving and updating records and things like that, we have to basically get a reference to the iOrganization service itself, and we get that through our service factory, which is done via the service provider, which we mentioned, which we've referenced earlier. And then the core bit down here is based on if the entity names are of these potential values down here, then we calculate it as a line item record. Otherwise, if it's one of these entities, then it's a sales document, so therefore we calculate it using that method down there. Otherwise, if it's none of those, then something's gone wrong clearly, so we need to throw an error, and we do that down there. We've also got because it's in a try-catch block as well, there's also some error handling down here. So most of this code here is actually based off the SDK sample, which you can find on Microsoft's website. Just been tinkered around here to suit the particular needs for this scenario. Now, I mentioned earlier there's a bug at the moment where when you try and when it tries to calculate extended amounts for quote lines, specifically when you generate them from opportunity records, that calculation doesn't occur. I'm not too sure if this is a bug or if something else is going wrong with the system. So what this particular logic here does is that it basically overrides that by, okay, so by providing the means to run custom pricing when a quote product record is created, and therefore make sure that the extended amount values are properly calculated. So this requires an additional step when we're deploying the plugin out to get it all working, which we'll go through and discuss in a few short minutes, but I just wanted to mention specifically there what that's doing. Okay, so with everything done from a code point of view, all we need to do now is just save that, just build our solution, just make sure it's all good to go. And with that done, we can then actually get this plugin deployed out to our system. So we do this via the plugin registration tool. So if we navigate to the folder for our particular solution, we go to the packages folder, plugin registration, and then tools. We can see down here we've got an executable for the plugin registration tool. We click on that there, go to create new connection. I'm just going to log into my instance down here. Select that down there. And then from here we then register the plugin step to our particular instance. So we do register new, no, we don't do that first of all. We do register new assembly first of all. We need to navigate back a ways through our folders. We then go to our bin and debug. And then it's this one on here, custom pricing sample, which we open up there. As you can see, we've got a single plugin within there, single execute method in there that we want to be able to use. So just make sure that's all ticked. Click on register selected plugins. That's now been registered to the system. And now we need to go through the somewhat laborious process of basically setting up our steps for our various messages. And we have to do this for each of the entities that we want as part of the calculate price method. We need to do a step for each one of those, and then finally we need to do a create step for the quote product entity to make sure that we can handle that rather strange situation. So we'll do the quote detail one first of all. So it's our create message that we want on there. Primary entity will be quote detail. This is a post operation plugin that's run synchronously. So with all that configured, we do register new step down there. And then now we can go through and start to add on our remaining entities for our calculate price. So we'll do this in order. So opportunity, post operation, yep, that's fine. Opportunity product. So previously in older versions, I think version 8 and before, what you could do is just specify it to run on all applicable entities, but now they've changed it so that you have to do it for each one, which kind of makes sense, but it does obviously mean there's a little bit more work involved. But hopefully as part of this you'll at least get a thorough grasping of how to use the plugin registration tool. So about halfway there now. So sales, we need to do calculate price, sales order, sales order detail, nearly there, and then we've got our calculate price, invoice, and then finally calculate price, invoice detail. Okay, so we're good to go. So this is all registered out now. So it will take effect immediately within the application. So as soon as these steps are registered, whenever you start to create or work with records, then you'll start to see this behaviour kick in. So all that's left for us to do is just run a quick test now, just to basically confirm that it's all working as expected. So I'm going to go to our opportunities entity. So we'll call this calculate price test. We'll add on our an account record. For type to search, should we do a datum? Let's do Alpine Ski House. Alpine Ski House doesn't get any love, does it? So click save on there. So first of all, we've got an error on there because I've rather stupidly forgot to put in our discount percentage. So this is the custom field that we talked about earlier. So I'll just put in a discount percentage of 30%. So press save on that. So with that all done, we can now actually start to put on our product records. But we need a price list. Always helps if you do the essential steps first, I find. So add product. So we're going to want to find our existing products. So this will be the CRM Online Enterprise. Only just about remember those now. So it's picked up all the information on there. If we click save now, we can see that it's actually gone off and done some work for us. So it's figured out that our manual discount amount needs to be £15 based on that. It's also totted up our £60 as well. £25 it's done as our freight amount automatically on there. I'm not too sure actually if Alpine Ski House is actually set up with a location, but let's verify on that. So let's check this. Oh no, because it's an opportunity record, isn't it? Yep. So because it's an opportunity record at this point, it can't actually figure out what our particular freight amounts are. So therefore it's defaulted as £25. But we can see that every other calculation is basically done a-okay on there. If I just put an additional 20 on there for tax, again it should update fine on there. And if we go back onto our opportunity record, again we can see it's done all the various figuring out of our different totals down there, which is really nice. And because this has been configured at the opportunity level, this will all then feed through automatically as well. So the solution that's been built out has got all the appropriate field mappings built out. So when we do a new quote, for example, all of the information should filter through. If we go on here and check the product, then it should also do it should also calculate what the potential freight amount is on that. I don't think the field's been added onto that form, but if we go back onto our quote, so we can see, yeah, the information has been filtered through automatically, and if we so choose, we can choose to add on some additional products. So maybe we just want to add a writing product, so maybe Power BI Professional, let's say. It's about £17.50 these days. We want 10 of those. Save that. So again, we can see it's gone there and it's applied all the logic on there, which is really good. So yeah, as we can see, it's taken us just under probably about 40 minutes to basically build the solution out from start to finish. And as we can see, we're able to do quite a lot with this to be able to get the application working, not just with custom fields, but also doing all sorts of different custom logic as well, which is really nice. So yeah, that's how you do a custom pricing plugin. Alright, so hopefully that's been useful. You've been able to see what the broad outline process is from start to finish and see exactly what is involved when you're building out a custom pricing solution. What I wanted to do to finish off was to go through a couple of things based on my experience that you should watch out for when you're developing these solutions. Hopefully this will be quite useful potentially for you. So you notice in the demo that we had to do some specific logic in there to calculate to basically specify a shared variable and then storing that and referencing that back as part of our parent context. This is a mandatory requirement and is there for a very important reason. It's to prevent any logic that you develop from running infinitely behind the scenes and therefore errors being generated. The application is really good at being able to recognize when an infinite loop is taking place and will stop that before it runs forever, but you'll still get an error message in the application when this occurs. So having this logic in here to check the parent context is really useful, and you should make sure that's always included as part of your plugin code.
I think to know if you are using the project service automation application, then I will stress there will be some additional work that you have to do to get a custom pricing solution play nice with project service automation. The key thing, or a key example of this, is the fact that PSA, for example, has a lot of custom logic that works on top of the various line item records. So you specify your various resources that you need as part of a particular opportunity. That's then calculated up as part of detail records onto the line item. And there's some very specific logic in there as part of PSA that checks to make sure that your detail amounts total up to any product line amount. And if it doesn't, then you're going to start getting errors potentially. So a key thing to watch out for is if you are using PSA, there's going to be some additional work that you need to do to make sure that it all works, or basically plays nice together effectively. What I would say, if you are currently using on-premise version of Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement or CRM, then be aware that you may need to carefully review your custom pricing solution if you decide to lift and shift it onto the cloud. This may, in most cases, be down to the way in which custom plugins work online compared to on-premise, so things like sandbox and timeout execution and things like that. But more generally, depending on what type of code that you are using, you may be restrained a lot more online compared to on-premise. Just keep that in mind if you are thinking about moving a custom pricing solution onto the cloud eventually. An important consideration really in light of some of the changes that happened from a licensing standpoint is that I would encourage you to consider any impact a custom pricing solution will have on your API calls within the application. So Microsoft have changed things now so that you now have set limits for each user or license type on the number of API transactions that are allowed. This will eventually, I believe, be an enforced limit where users will start to receive error messages if they exceed those limits. So what I would say is that, okay, because you're using the SDK, using a plugin as part of this, that's going to count as as an API call for a particular user. So I would recommend that you do some scoping out. You look at the amount of records, the amount of activities your users are doing onto your sales records on a day-by-day basis, and if it is potentially going to be, if it's going to exceed any potential licensing limits, then you're going to have to look at that and factor in additional cost for any custom pricing solution that sits on top. And really, it's important to stress at this stage, okay, custom pricing solution is really great, but it's not going to solve all your problems. So for example, a custom pricing solution is not going to let you add on any custom calculations on top of your custom entities. So for example, you can't add on a custom entity as part of the calculate price message and have any logic trigger as part of that. This is really just focused on the core out of the box entities. You're going to have the same limitations around plugins that I mentioned earlier, so sandboxing, execution timeouts, things like that. You're going to have to consider and factor in. And really, you can't be in a situation where you say, okay, I want to have a half and half. So, for example, I want quote an opportunity to run out of the box calculations as the application behaves, and for all other entities, invoice and order, to use my custom pricing logic. Really, you're going to have to basically say, right, we either use the out of the box calculations or we're going to go down the custom route. There's nothing to stop you from putting logic in place to mirror how the application behaves out of the box, but you are going to have to go in and do that potential work. So just keep that and these other potential limitations in mind when you are doing the scoping and thinking about implementing a custom pricing solution. So in closing then, so for me really, custom pricing solutions are really great when you've got a potential gap from a functionality standpoint between how your business processes need to operate and how Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement behaves out of the box. It provides you a really nice mechanism of being able to further tailor the application to suit the business and not the other way around. And really, the fact that we've got it there makes it a really invaluable feature, and one which, thanks in part to the many different code examples and instructions that Microsoft very kindly provided. So long as you've got a bit of C# knowledge, you can get up and running with this really quite quickly. It's not going to be rocket science. You're not going to be banging your head against the wall for ages. It's a really nice solution to consider into the mix to get the application working how you need it to. What I would say though,
and to sort of play devil's advocate, really, you mentioned already around the API limits. You need to really think hard about this, and I would maybe comment, okay, well, could this potentially be a barrier, concerning its adoption in the future? Is it this really great functionality that we've got going to become less used and less useful because we're worried about expensive API, expensive licenses to give us those additional API calls? That's some, and as I mentioned before, you need to think about that very carefully when you are implementing the solution. And really, I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and sort of say, okay, this is going to make your deployment simple to manage and it's going to make everything run beautifully. Let's face facts. You're introducing custom code into your custom engagement deployment. There's going to have to be an overhead there in terms of having somebody in the business who can interact with that and knows how to manage that. And most importantly, if that ever changes, you're going to have somebody on. You're going to have to basically address any knowledge deficit so that the solution can be maintained, and you're not in a situation where it's falling to the dust or it's not keeping up with how the business is operating. So really, just keep in mind, this is going to cause some complexity when you implement it. Okay, so I've left some links on here to some useful articles on the Microsoft Docs website, and also a few blog posts that I've done previously on the subject. Hopefully this will give you a bit more of a deep dive view into some of the things that we discussed here today, as well as what we've mentioned around the project service automation, limitations and things to watch out for there. So yeah, feel free to go on there and have a look at those. But all that's left for me to say today is thank you very much for listening. Hope you found this really useful. My contact details are on there if you need anything at all, so feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to have a conversation about custom pricing or anything to do with Dynamics 365 customer engagement. And good luck coding, and catch you around. Take care. Bye.